Sarah Martinez pushed through the glass doors of the corporate cafeteria, her black blazer crisp against the morning chill that followed her inside. At 42, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that most people mistook for simple professionalism. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her brown eyes swept the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned long ago to assess every environment she entered. The Hartwell & Associates consulting firm buzzed with its usual morning energy. Young analysts clutched their coffee cups like lifelines, discussing quarterly projections and client presentations. Sarah had been working here for 8 months now, transitioning from her previous career into the corporate world. It was different from what she was used to, but she appreciated the structure and the challenge of applying her analytical skills to business problems. She grabbed a tray and moved through the breakfast line, selecting oatmeal with fresh berries and a cup of black coffee. The cafeteria was one of the building's nicer features, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline and modern furniture arranged in clusters throughout the space. Sarah usually ate breakfast here before heading up to the 15th floor where her office was located. As she turned to find a seat, she noticed 3 men from the marketing department sitting at a corner table. Brad Henderson, the department's director, was holding court as usual. His voice carried across the space, animated and loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. Next to him sat Marcus Webb, a senior account manager known for his aggressive sales tactics, and Jake Morrison, a younger associate who seemed to follow Brad's lead in everything. Sarah had minimal interaction with them during her time at the company. Their paths rarely crossed professionally, and she preferred to keep her work relationships focused and purposeful. She found an empty table near the windows and settled in with her breakfast, pulling out her tablet to review the morning's reports. The consulting project she was leading involved streamlining operations for a manufacturing client. It required deep analysis of their supply chain, workforce efficiency, and technological infrastructure. Sarah excelled at breaking down complex systems and identifying areas for improvement. Her background had given her skills in problem-solving and strategic thinking that translated well to business consulting. As she scrolled through data charts, fragments of conversation drifted over from the marketing table. Brad's voice rose above the general cafeteria noise, and she caught words like diversity hire and special treatment. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her eyes on her work. She had heard similar comments before in various workplaces and had learned to pick her battles carefully. The morning progressed normally until Sarah stood to clear her tray. As she walked past the marketing table, Brad's voice stopped her cold. "Speaking of government waste," he said, loud enough for half the cafeteria to hear, "I heard our new consultant used to be in the military. Probably got her job through some veteran preference program. These people think they deserve special treatment just because they wore a uniform." Marcus laughed and added, "Yeah, and now we're supposed to pretend they're qualified for real jobs. Most of them can't function outside of taking orders." Jake, eager to contribute, chimed in with, "My cousin was in the army, and all he talks about is how tough military training was." Like, okay, we get it. You did push-ups. That doesn't make you special. Sarah's grip on her tray tightened. She stood frozen for a moment, feeling the familiar surge of controlled anger that she had learned to manage over 2 decades of service. The cafeteria seemed to quiet around her, though she wasn't sure if it was real or just her heightened awareness of the situation. Other employees at nearby tables had noticed the exchange. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious about how it would unfold. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see how she would respond. She turned slowly to face the 3 men, her expression calm but her posture subtly shifting. Anyone who knew what to look for would have recognized the change, the way her shoulders squared, how her weight distributed evenly on her feet, the slight adjustment in her stance that suggested someone prepared for confrontation. "Excuse me," she said, her voice level and clear. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." Brad looked up with a smirk, clearly enjoying the attention his comments had generated. "Oh, hey Sarah. We were just discussing hiring practices. Nothing personal." "It sounded pretty personal to me," she replied, taking a step closer to their table. "Especially since you were talking about my qualifications and how I got my job." Marcus leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Well, if the shoe fits. I mean, it's no secret that companies get tax breaks for hiring veterans. Pretty convenient, right? The comment hit exactly the way it was intended to. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but her training kicked in automatically. She had faced down enemy combatants, survived firefights, and led missions in some of the world's most dangerous places. 3 corporate bullies in a cafeteria weren't going to rattle her. "You think my military service makes me less qualified for this job?" she asked, her tone remaining steady despite the anger building beneath the surface. Jake, emboldened by his colleague's behavior, decided to jump in. "Look, no offense, but military people are trained to follow orders, not to think creatively. This is a consulting firm. We need innovative thinkers, not people who just do what they're told." "Yeah," Brad added, warming to the topic. "And, let's be honest, what does shooting guns and marching around have to do with business strategy? This isn't a war zone." The irony of that last comment wasn't lost on Sarah. She had indeed operated in actual war zones, making split-second decisions that determined whether her team lived or died. She had led complex operations involving dozens of personnel, managed resources under extreme pressure, and solved problems that these 3 couldn't begin to imagine. But she also knew that revealing the true nature of her military service wouldn't help the situation. Most people had a limited understanding of what Special Operations Forces actually did. They pictured soldiers marching in formation or standing guard at gates, not the highly trained strategic thinkers who planned and executed some of the military's most complex missions. "I think you might be surprised by what military service actually involves," she said carefully. "Especially at higher levels of responsibility." Marcus scoffed. "Higher levels? What were you, like a sergeant or something? Telling people when to clean their rifles?" The question revealed just how little they understood about military structure and roles. Sarah had reached the rank of Master Chief Petty Officer during her Navy career, the highest enlisted rank in her rate. She had commanded teams, planned operations, and made decisions that affected international security. But explaining that to these 3 seemed pointless. "Something like that," she said quietly. Brad seemed to take her restrained response as confirmation of his assumptions. "See? I knew it. Look, Sarah, I'm sure you did your job fine in the military. But this is the private sector. It's competitive. It's about results, not following protocol. And it's about innovation," Jake added, clearly pleased with himself for remembering one of the company's buzzwords. Thinking outside the box. Military people are trained to think inside very specific boxes. Sarah felt a flash of something that might have been amusement if the situation weren't so frustrating. If they only knew about some of the boxes she had been required to think outside of during her career. The improvised solutions, the adaptive strategies, the ability to accomplish mission objectives when everything went wrong and the original plan was useless. "You seem very confident about what military people can and can't do," she observed. "It's just common sense," Marcus replied. "You guys are trained to follow orders without question. That's the opposite of what we need here. And, honestly," Brad continued, his voice growing louder and more animated, "it's kind of unfair to the rest of US who didn't have the government pay for our training. We had to earn our qualifications the hard way, through real education and real work experience." The comment about government-paid training struck a particular nerve. Sarah's military education had been extensive and ongoing throughout her career. She had attended advanced schools for tactics, leadership, foreign languages, and strategic planning. She held certifications and qualifications that most civilian employers had never heard of but that represented years of intensive study and practical application. More importantly, her real work experience had included deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and several other locations that weren't officially acknowledged. She had worked with intelligence agencies, foreign military units, and other special operations forces from around the world. The problems she had solved and the pressure she had operated under made corporate consulting look like a relaxing hobby. But she couldn't say any of that. The nature of her previous work meant that most of her achievements would forever remain classified. She couldn't tell them about the terrorist networks she had helped dismantle, the hostages she had helped rescue, or the strategic operations she had planned and led. Her military records would show her rank and basic service history, but the details of what she had actually done were locked away in government files. "I think you'd be surprised by the quality of military training," she said instead. "And by the complexity of the problems we're asked to solve." Jake laughed. "Problems like what? Which uniform to wear? How to march in a straight line?" The dismissive tone finally pushed Sarah past her breaking point. Not to anger, her training was too thorough for that, but to a decision point. She could walk away, as she had from countless similar situations throughout her civilian transition. Or she could give them a small glimpse of what they were actually dealing with. Problems like operating in foreign countries where one mistake could start an international incident, she said, her voice dropping to a quieter but more intense level. Like managing resources and personnel in life or death situations. Like making strategic decisions with incomplete information and no time for second guessing. Brad rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on. You're being a little dramatic, don't you think? We're talking about real jobs here, not action movies." "I'm not being dramatic," Sarah replied. "I'm being accurate." Marcus leaned forward, clearly enjoying what he perceived as his advantage in the confrontation. "Okay, let's say you're right. Let's say military service is this amazing training ground for business skills. Why are so many veterans struggling to find jobs? If you guys are so qualified, why do you need special programs to get hired?" The question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both veteran employment issues and the nature of military skills translation. Many veterans struggled not because they lacked qualifications, but because their qualifications didn't translate easily to civilian job descriptions. How do you put lead classified operations in hostile territory on a resume? How do you explain skills and experience that can't be verified or discussed in detail? "Maybe because people like you make assumptions about what we can and can't do," Sarah said. "Maybe because our actual qualifications can't be listed on a standard resume." "Right," Jake said with a smirk. "Secret qualifications. How convenient." Sarah studied the three men for a moment, recognizing the type. They were bullies who had found what they thought was an easy target. They assumed she would back down, apologize, or simply walk away. In their experience, that's what most people did when confronted with this kind of behavior. They had no idea that they were facing someone who had spent 20 years in situations where backing down meant people died. Someone who had been trained to remain calm under pressure, to assess threats accurately, and to respond with precisely the amount of force necessary to achieve her objectives. The objectives in this situation were simple: make it clear that their behavior was unacceptable while maintaining her professional reputation and avoiding any actions that could be used against her later. It required the same kind of strategic thinking she had applied to much more consequential problems. "Tell you what," she said, setting her tray down on their table with deliberate care. "Since you're so interested in military qualifications, let me give you a little education." Brad grinned, clearly thinking he had provoked her into an emotional outburst that would prove his point. "Oh, this should be good. Go ahead, enlighten us." Sarah pulled out the chair across from them and sat down slowly, her movements controlled and purposeful. The casual observer might have thought she was simply joining a friendly conversation. But anyone with experience in conflict situations would have recognized the predatory stillness in her posture. First, she began, her voice conversational but with an undercurrent that made the nearby tables go quiet. "Let me correct a few of your assumptions about what military service actually involves." The three men exchanged glances, suddenly less certain about the direction this conversation was taking. Sarah's demeanor had shifted in a way that was hard to define but impossible to ignore. She no longer looked like a consultant who had been offended by their comments. She looked like someone who was about to teach them something they weren't going to enjoy learning. Sarah leaned back in the chair she had claimed, her hands resting casually on the table. To anyone watching from across the cafeteria, it looked like four colleagues having a morning discussion over coffee. But the three men across from her were beginning to sense that something had fundamentally changed in the dynamic of their encounter. "So you want to know about military training," Sarah continued, her voice maintaining the same conversational tone. "Let me tell you about leadership development. By the time I was 25, I was responsible for the lives and careers of 36 people. Not their quarterly reviews or their project deadlines, their actual lives." Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but maintained his dismissive expression. "That's different. That's just managing soldiers." "Managing soldiers," Sarah repeated slowly. "You think managing people who are trained killers, armed with military-grade weapons, operating in hostile environments under extreme stress is easier than managing marketing consultants in an air-conditioned office?" Marcus tried to regain control of the conversation. "Look, we get that military leadership is challenging. But it's not the same as business leadership. In the military, people have to follow your orders. In business, you have to persuade them." Sarah's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You think military leadership is just giving orders and having people follow them? That shows me exactly how little you understand about either leadership or the military." She paused for a moment, studying each of their faces. Jake was beginning to look uncertain, glancing between his colleagues as if seeking reassurance. Marcus maintained his aggressive posture, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was starting to question his assumptions. Brad appeared to be doubling down on his position, his jaw set in stubborn determination. "Let me give you a real example," Sarah said. "Imagine you're leading a team into an environment where everyone wants to kill you. Your team members are highly trained, but they're also scared, exhausted, and dealing with the knowledge that they might not come home. You can't just order them to be brave. You can't mandate that they trust your judgment when the plan goes wrong, and you have to improvise under fire." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a level that forced them to strain to hear her. "You have to earn their loyalty every single day. You have to make decisions that balance mission objectives with keeping your people alive. You have to be ready to sacrifice yourself for any one of them, and they have to know that you mean it. That's not command and control, that's leadership in its purest form." Jake swallowed hard. "But that's still different from business. In business, you're not dealing with life and death. Aren't you?" Sarah asked. "When a company fails, people lose their jobs. Families lose their homes. Communities lose their economic foundation. The scale might be different, but the consequences are very real for the people involved." She gestured toward the window overlooking the city. "Every decision we make in this building affects someone's life. Maybe not as immediately as a combat decision, but the ripple effects can be just as significant over time. The difference is that military training teaches you to think about those consequences before you act, not after." Marcus attempted to regain his footing. "Okay, fine. But you still haven't explained how shooting guns and blowing things up translates to business skills." Sarah's laugh was quiet but somehow unsettling. "Shooting guns and blowing things up. Is that really what you think special operations forces do?" "Special operations?" Brad said with a sneer. "Come on. You're really going to claim you were special ops? What's next, Navy SEALs?" The silence that followed his question stretched for several long seconds. Sarah didn't respond immediately, but something in her expression caused all three men to suddenly pay very close attention to her answer. "Actually," she said quietly, "that's exactly what I'm going to claim." The skepticism on their faces was immediate and obvious. Marcus actually laughed out loud. "Right. Sure you were. And I suppose you can't prove it because it's all classified, right?" "Some of it is classified," Sarah replied calmly. "But my service record isn't. I served 20 years in the Navy, with the last 12 in special operations. I retired as a Master Chief Petty Officer. Those are facts that can be easily verified." Jake looked confused. "Master Chief? Like on that TV show?" Sarah's patience was beginning to wear thin, but she maintained her composed exterior. "Not like the TV show, no. Master Chief Petty Officer is the highest enlisted rank in my rating. It typically requires 15 to 20 years to achieve, and it comes with significant leadership and operational responsibilities.
Brad wasn't backing down. Even if that's true, and I'm not saying it is, it doesn't change anything. Military experience still doesn't qualify you for consulting work. Doesn't it? Sarah asked.
Let me walk you through a typical day in my previous job, and you tell me if you see any business applications.
She didn't wait for their permission to continue. Let's say we're planning an operation to extract a high-value target from a hostile urban environment.
First, we need intelligence gathering and analysis. We collect information from multiple sources, evaluate its reliability, identify patterns and gaps, and build a comprehensive picture of the operating environment.
Sound familiar?
Marcus frowned, clearly seeing where she was headed but not wanting to acknowledge it.
Next, we develop multiple operational plans based on different scenarios. We consider resource requirements, timeline constraints, risk factors, contingency planning, and success metrics. We have to account for budget limitations, personnel capabilities, equipment availability, and political considerations. Sarah's voice remained steady and professional, but there was an intensity building beneath the surface. We brief stakeholders at multiple levels, from team members to senior leadership to allied organizations. We have to communicate complex information clearly and persuasively, adjust our approach based on feedback, and build consensus around our strategy. Jake was beginning to look uncomfortable. But that's still military stuff. It's not the same as business consulting. Isn't it? Sarah challenged.
Replace high-value target with market opportunity and hostile urban environment with competitive marketplace. Replace extraction operation with product launch or corporate restructuring. The fundamental skills are identical: strategic thinking, risk assessment, resource management, stakeholder communication, and adaptive planning. She paused to let that sink in before continuing. The difference is that in my previous job, if I made a mistake, people died. Here, if I make a mistake, maybe a project fails or a client is unhappy. The pressure and consequences were actually higher in the military, not lower. Brad was clearly frustrated by the direction the conversation had taken.
Look, you can dress it up however you want, but, what?
Sarah interrupted, her voice taking on an edge for the first time.
But, you've already made up your mind about what military people are capable of? But, you're not interested in facts that contradict your prejudices?
The change in her tone caused heads to turn at nearby tables. The cafeteria's background noise seemed to fade as more people began paying attention to the increasingly tense exchange.
Marcus decided to try a different approach. Even if everything you're saying is true, you still got hired through a veteran preference program. You still had an unfair advantage over other candidates. Did I? Sarah asked. Tell me, what exactly do you know about how I got hired?
The three men exchanged glances, suddenly realizing they had been making assumptions without any actual knowledge of her hiring process.
I thought so, Sarah continued. For your information, I went through the exact same interview process as every other consultant at this firm. I submitted the same application, took the same assessments, and interviewed with the same people.
The only difference is that I have 20 years of experience solving complex problems under pressure, leading high-performance teams, and delivering results in environments where failure wasn't an option. She stood up slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled.
But, you're right about one thing. I did have an advantage over other candidates. I had better qualifications.
Jake made one last attempt to salvage his position.
Okay, but you have to admit that the military mindset doesn't always fit in corporate culture. You guys are used to a very rigid hierarchy and following orders without question. Sarah looked down at him with something that might have been pity. Following orders without question. You really believe that's how special operations work?
She shook her head slowly.
Let me explain something to you about special operations culture.
We're trained to think independently, to adapt quickly when plans change, to take initiative in fluid situations, and to challenge ideas that don't make sense. We're encouraged to speak up when we see problems, to propose alternative solutions, and to push back on orders that seem wrong or dangerous. Her voice grew quieter but more intense. In fact, blind obedience is actively discouraged in special operations because it gets people killed. We need operators who can think for themselves, make rapid decisions with incomplete information, and take responsibility for the consequences of their actions. Brad made a last-ditch effort to maintain his position.
That still doesn't explain why companies should give special treatment to veterans. Why should your military experience matter more than someone else's civilian experience? Sarah's smile was cold. Special treatment? You mean like expecting to be judged on my actual qualifications rather than your stereotypes? Like being evaluated based on my performance rather than your assumptions about what military people can and can't do?
She leaned forward, placing her hands on their table.
Here's what I think is really bothering you. It's not that you think I'm unqualified. It's that you're afraid I might be more qualified than you are. The accusation hung in the air between them.
Marcus shifted uncomfortably, Jake looked away, and Brad's face flushed red.
That's ridiculous, Brad sputtered. We're just concerned about fair hiring practices. Are you? Sarah asked. Because it sounds to me like you're concerned about competition.
You've gotten comfortable in an environment where your biggest challenge is impressing clients with PowerPoint presentations and networking at company happy hours. The idea that someone with real operational experience might outperform you is threatening. She straightened up, looking down at them with calm assessment.
Let me give you some free advice about fair competition.
If you're worried about veteran hiring programs, don't try to tear down the veterans. Try to improve your own qualifications.
Marcus finally lost his temper. Who do you think you are, talking to us like this? You think being in the military makes you better than everyone else? Sarah's response was immediate and delivered with Arctic calm.
No, I don't think being in the military makes me better than everyone else. But I do think my 20 years of operational experience, leadership responsibility, and proven performance under pressure make me more qualified for this job than 3 marketing executives who think strategic planning means deciding which restaurant to take clients to for lunch.
The silence that followed was deafening.
Several nearby tables had stopped all pretense of their own conversations and were openly watching the confrontation unfold. Jake, clearly recognizing that the situation had spiraled beyond their control, attempted to de-escalate.
Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. We weren't trying to be disrespectful.
Sarah studied his face for a moment, seeing something that might have been genuine regret. But, before she could respond, Brad, apparently unable to let it go, made one final mistake.
You know what? I don't care what you did in the military.
This is the private sector, and if you can't handle a little workplace discussion without getting all aggressive and defensive, maybe you're not as qualified as you think you are. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt something shift inside her, a cold clarity that she recognized from situations where diplomacy had failed and other measures became necessary. When she spoke again, her voice was so quiet that people at the surrounding tables had to strain to hear her. But every word carried the weight of absolute certainty. Gentlemen, she said, I think it's time you learned exactly what kind of qualifications you've been questioning. The cafeteria had grown noticeably quieter as more employees became aware of the confrontation unfolding at the corner table. Sarah remained standing, her posture relaxed but ready, while the 3 marketing executives sat before her with varying degrees of discomfort and defiance. You want to know about qualifications, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the now attentive space. Let me tell you about a Tuesday morning in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, 2018. Brad opened his mouth to interrupt, but something in Sarah's expression stopped him cold.
We received intelligence that a high-value terrorist leader was meeting with foreign weapons suppliers in a compound outside the city.
The meeting was scheduled for dawn the next day, which gave us less than 18 hours to plan, resource, and execute a capture-or-kill mission in hostile territory. She paused, noting how Jake had gone pale and Marcus was no longer making eye contact. The compound was in a densely populated civilian area, with multiple escape routes, unknown numbers of armed guards, and the possibility of civilian casualties if things went wrong.
The political ramifications of a failed mission or civilian deaths would have been international news within hours. Sarah began to pace slowly around their table, her movement controlled and deliberate. So let me walk you through the kind of problem solving you think doesn't apply to business consulting. She stopped behind Brad's chair, close enough that he had to turn to see her. First, intelligence analysis. We had information from 3 different sources, each with varying degrees of reliability. Some of it was confirmed, some was speculation, and some was potentially disinformation planted by the enemy. Sound like any business situation you've encountered? Trying to make strategic decisions based on incomplete, contradictory, or unreliable market research? Brad shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. Sarah moved to stand behind Marcus. Next, resource allocation. We had a limited number of personnel, specific equipment requirements, budget constraints, and a non-negotiable timeline. We needed air support, ground vehicles, communications equipment, medical backup, and extraction assets. Every resource we used for this mission was a resource that couldn't be used somewhere else. How is that different from managing a project budget and timeline while competing for limited company resources? Marcus stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Then, there's stakeholder management, Sarah continued, moving to stand behind Jake. I had to coordinate with Army intelligence, Air Force pilots, local Afghan military units, State Department officials, and CIA operatives. Each group had their own objectives, protocols, and chain of command. I had to build consensus around our plan while accommodating their constraints and concerns. Jake's hands were visibly trembling as he reached for his coffee cup. Sarah returned to stand at the head of their table, her voice growing more intense. But, here's where it gets really interesting from a business perspective. 3 hours before the mission was supposed to launch, everything changed. Our primary intelligence source was compromised, the target location shifted to a different compound, and half of our air support was redirected to another operation. She leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the table. So tell me, gentlemen, what would you do in that situation? How would you handle a complete strategic pivot with zero additional time for planning, when failure could result in the deaths of your team members and an international incident that would affect foreign policy for years to come? The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Brad finally spoke, his voice significantly less confident than before. That's not the same thing as business consulting. Isn't it? Sarah asked. Last month, our client's primary competitor launched an unexpected product that completely changed the market landscape. We had 72 hours to revise our entire strategic recommendation and present it to their board of directors. The client's market position and the jobs of 300 employees depended on our ability to adapt quickly and provide a solution that worked. She straightened up, her voice taking on a lecturing tone that made it clear she was just getting started. The only difference was that in Afghanistan, if I made a mistake, the consequences were immediate and violent. Here, the consequences are delayed and financial. But the fundamental skills required, rapid analysis, adaptive planning, decisive leadership, and execution under pressure, are identical. Marcus made an attempt to regain some ground. Okay, but that's just one example. Military operations are planned and structured. Business requires creativity and innovation. Sarah's laugh was genuinely amused for the first time since the conversation began. Planned and structured. You think military operations go according to plan? She pulled out her phone and set it on the table. There's a military saying, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Do you know what that means? It means that every single operation requires constant improvisation, creative problem-solving, and innovative thinking just to survive. Her expression grew serious again. You want to talk about innovation? Let me tell you about the time we had to extract a captured asset from a terrorist compound using nothing but a stolen food delivery truck, 3 smoke grenades, and a plan we improvised in 15 minutes because everything else had gone wrong. Jake finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. How did you do it? Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine curiosity rather than skepticism for the first time. We studied the compound's daily routines and
noticed that food deliveries came at the same time every morning. We intercepted the delivery truck, modified it with hidden compartments and communications equipment, and used it to infiltrate the compound. She began to pace again, her voice taking on the rhythm of someone reliving a complex operation. One team member played the delivery driver while two others hid in the modified truck. I coordinated from an overwatch position with a sniper team providing backup. We had to time everything perfectly, disable the guards, locate and extract the asset, and get out before reinforcements arrived. Brad was listening despite himself.
Did it work?
It worked, Sarah confirmed. But only because we were able to think creatively under extreme pressure, adapt to changing circumstances, and execute a plan that none of us had ever tried before.
If that's not innovation, I don't know what is.
She stopped pacing and looked directly at each of them in turn.
And that's just one example from one operation.
Over 20 years, I planned and executed dozens of missions that required creative solutions to impossible problems. I managed teams, budgets, and resources while operating in environments where the rules changed constantly and failure wasn't an option. Marcus made one more attempt to maintain his position. But military training teaches you to think in a specific way. It doesn't prepare you for the ambiguity and complexity of business situations.
Sarah's smile was sharp. Ambiguity and complexity? You think business situations are more ambiguous and complex than guerrilla warfare in foreign countries where you don't speak the language, don't understand the culture, and can't tell who's an enemy and who's a potential ally?
She moved closer to his chair, her voice dropping to a conversational level that somehow felt more threatening than if she had been shouting.
Let me tell you about ambiguity, Marcus.
Imagine trying to build relationships with tribal leaders who may or may not be supporting the people trying to kill you, while navigating political considerations that you're not fully briefed on, in a region where the strategic objectives change based on news cycles back home.
Marcus swallowed hard but didn't respond.
Or imagine planning operations where the rules of engagement are constantly evolving, where legal and ethical considerations have to be balanced against operational effectiveness, and where every decision you make will be scrutinized by lawyers, politicians, and journalists who weren't there and don't understand the context.
Sarah straightened up and addressed all three of them. You think corporate consulting involves complex stakeholder management?
Try coordinating with allies who don't trust each other, military branches that compete for resources, intelligence agencies that don't share information, and political officials who have their own agendas.
Jake looked genuinely shaken. I had no idea. I thought military operations were just about following orders and shooting at bad guys.
Most people think that, Sarah replied, her voice softening slightly.
That's because most of what we do can't be discussed publicly.
The successful operations never make the news, and the details of how we accomplish our objectives are classified for decades. She sat back down across from them, her posture still alert but less overtly threatening. Which brings me back to your original point about qualifications and special treatment. You're right that my military record doesn't tell the whole story of what I'm capable of. But that's not because it overstates my qualifications, it's because it understates them. Brad had been quiet for several minutes, but now he spoke up with obvious reluctance.
What do you mean?
I mean that everything I've told you today barely scratches the surface, Sarah replied. Most of my operational experience is classified and will remain so for years to come. The leadership challenges, strategic problems, and complex operations that define my career can't be put on a resume or discussed in a job interview. She gestured around the cafeteria, where dozens of employees were still watching their conversation with obvious interest. So when I apply for civilian jobs, I have to translate 20 years of experience solving life and death problems into language that sounds like typical management responsibilities. I have to downplay the complexity and significance of what I've done because most people can't relate to it.
Marcus looked confused. Then, why don't you just explain it the way you're explaining it now? Sarah's expression grew tired. Because most people react the way you three did when I first sat down.
They assume I'm exaggerating or trying to make myself sound more important than I am. They think military experience is irrelevant to civilian work, so they don't want to hear about it. She paused for a moment, then continued with obvious frustration.
Or they go in the other direction and assume that all veterans are damaged or dangerous. They worry that we can't function in normal workplaces, that we're too aggressive, or that we have PTSD. Either way, they're making decisions based on stereotypes rather than actual qualifications. Jake looked genuinely remorseful. I never thought about it that way. I guess I just assumed that military experience was different. Not applicable to civilian jobs. It is different, Sarah agreed. But different doesn't mean irrelevant. The skills you develop in special operations, strategic thinking, leadership under pressure, adaptive problem solving, team building, risk management, these are exactly the skills that make good consultants. She looked at each of them in turn. The difference is that we developed these skills in an environment where the stakes were higher and the margin for error was smaller than anything you'll encounter in corporate America. Brad had been listening with increasing discomfort, and now he made what appeared to be an attempt at reconciliation. Look, Sarah, maybe we came on a little strong earlier. We weren't trying to be disrespectful to your service. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of genuine understanding rather than mere damage control. Weren't you? Because from where I sit, it sounded exactly like disrespect. You dismissed 20 years of experience without knowing anything about what that experience involved. She leaned forward slightly. And, more importantly, you made assumptions about my qualifications, my hiring, and my capabilities based entirely on stereotypes about military personnel. That's not just disrespectful, it's discriminatory. The word discriminatory seemed to hit them like a physical blow. Marcus looked around nervously, suddenly, aware that their conversation was being observed by a significant portion of the cafeteria. We weren't trying to discriminate, he said quickly. We were just expressing our opinions about hiring practices. Your opinions about hiring practices, Sarah repeated slowly. Based on what expertise? What do any of you know about veteran employment, military training, or the transition challenges faced by people leaving the service? None of them answered immediately. That's what I thought, Sarah continued. You're expressing strong opinions about something you know nothing about, and those opinions are affecting how you treat a colleague. That's exactly how discrimination works. Jake looked genuinely upset. I really didn't mean it that way. I was just repeating things I'd heard other people say. And where do you think those other people heard it? Sarah asked. Stereotypes don't exist in a vacuum. They're perpetuated by people who repeat them without questioning whether they're true. She stood up again, this time with an air of finality. Here's what's going to happen next. You three are going to think very carefully about this conversation. You're going to consider whether your attitudes toward military personnel are based on facts or stereotypes. And you're going to decide whether you want to be the kind of people who judge their colleagues based on prejudice rather than performance. Her voice grew harder. Because if I hear any more comments about diversity hires or special treatment or assumptions about what military people can and can't do, we're going to have a very different kind of conversation. The kind that involves HR, documentation, and formal complaints about workplace discrimination. The three marketing executives sat in stunned silence as Sarah's words settled over them. The cafeteria around them had grown noticeably quieter, with conversations at nearby tables reduced to whispers as employees strained to hear the conclusion of the confrontation that had commanded their attention for the past 20 minutes. Sarah remained standing, her posture conveying both professional composure and unmistakable authority. She had said what needed to be said, and now she was prepared to deal with whatever consequences followed. Brad was the first to break the silence, his voice subdued and lacking the aggressive confidence he had displayed earlier. Sarah, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. We weren't trying to attack you personally. Weren't you? Sarah replied, her tone suggesting she found his claim unconvincing. Because targeting someone's qualifications, questioning their hiring process, and making derogatory comments about their background sounds pretty personal to me. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly recognizing that the conversation had moved beyond mere workplace disagreement into territory that could have serious professional consequences. Look, maybe we expressed ourselves poorly. We were just having a discussion about hiring policies in general. Sarah's smile was cold and humorless.
A discussion about hiring policies that happened to focus specifically on my military background and my qualifications for my job.
What an interesting coincidence.
Jake, who had appeared increasingly remorseful throughout the latter part of the conversation, finally spoke up with what seemed like genuine regret.
You're right. We were out of line.
I don't know anything about military service or what it involves, and I shouldn't have made assumptions. Sarah studied his face carefully, looking for signs that his apology was motivated by fear of consequences rather than actual understanding. What she saw was a young man who appeared genuinely shaken by the realization of what he had participated in. Jake, let me ask you something, she said, her voice losing some of its hard edge.
Before today, what did you actually know about what Special Operations Forces do? He thought for a moment before answering honestly. Basically nothing.
I guess I thought it was like the movies, shooting and explosions and jumping out of helicopters.
And where did that impression come from? Sarah pressed.
Movies, TV shows, video games, he admitted.
I never really thought about the reality of it. Sarah nodded slowly. That's exactly the problem.
Most people's understanding of military service comes from entertainment media, which focuses on action and violence because that's what makes for exciting viewing. It doesn't show the strategic planning, the complex decision-making, or the leadership challenges that actually define military careers. She sat back down, this time choosing a chair that allowed her to address all three men equally.
And that's not entirely your fault.
The military doesn't do a good job of explaining what we actually do, partly because much of it is classified, and partly because we're not good at translating our skills into civilian terms.
Marcus looked surprised by the slightly more conciliatory tone. So you're saying we shouldn't be blamed for not understanding?
I'm saying ignorance is understandable, Sarah replied carefully.
But willful ignorance is not.
When you make assumptions about someone's capabilities based on incomplete or inaccurate information, and then use those assumptions to belittle them professionally, that crosses the line from ignorance into discrimination. She paused to let that distinction sink in before continuing. The difference between Jake's response and yours is that he's acknowledged his ignorance and seems willing to learn from it. You're still trying to justify your behavior. Brad had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, but now he attempted to regain some control of the situation.
I think we're all getting a little carried away here. This is just a workplace disagreement, not some kind of discrimination case. Sarah's expression hardened again. A workplace disagreement about what, exactly? About whether I'm qualified for my job? About whether I deserve to work here? About whether my military service makes me less capable than civilian employees?
She leaned forward, her voice taking on the quiet intensity that had marked the most serious moments of their confrontation.
Brad, let me explain something to you about workplace discrimination.
It's not just about obviously hostile behavior like racial slurs or gender-based harassment. It's also about creating an environment where certain groups of people are made to feel unwelcome or are subjected to different standards than their colleagues. The legal implications of her words were not lost on any of them. Marcus glanced nervously toward the other tables, clearly aware that their conversation had attracted significant attention from other employees. Comments about diversity hires and special treatment create exactly that kind of environment, Sarah continued. They send a message that veterans, or any other protected group, don't belong here on their own merits. They suggest that our achievements are somehow illegitimate and that we should be grateful for whatever opportunities we're given.
Jake looked genuinely distressed. I never thought about it that way. I really didn't mean to make you feel unwelcome.
I know you didn't, Sarah replied, her tone softening slightly when she addressed him. But impact matters more than intent. The effect of your comments was to question my right to be here and to suggest that my qualifications were somehow artificial or inflated. She turned back to Brad and Marcus, her expression becoming stern again.
And, frankly, I'm not convinced that intent is the issue with you too.
You seemed quite deliberate in your decision to target my military background and question my professional standing. Brad's face flushed red, but he attempted to maintain his defensive posture. You're reading too much into a casual conversation.
We weren't targeting anyone. Casual conversation, Sarah repeated slowly. Is that what you call loudly discussing someone's qualifications and hiring process in a crowded cafeteria where they can clearly hear you? She stood up again, her movement sharp and decisive. Let me tell you what I think actually happened here. You three saw an opportunity to demonstrate your superiority over someone you perceived as different. You thought you could score some easy points by mocking military personnel because you assumed we wouldn't fight back effectively in a corporate environment. The accuracy of her assessment was written clearly on their faces, even as they tried to maintain expressions of denial. You miscalculated, Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent cafeteria. You assumed that military training would make me rigid and inflexible in a civilian workplace dispute. You thought I would either back down or respond inappropriately, either of which would have validated your stereotypes. She began to pace again, her movement controlled but predatory. What you didn't account for is that special operations training specifically focuses on adaptive thinking and proportional response. We're taught to assess threats accurately and respond with exactly the level of force necessary to achieve our objectives. Marcus swallowed hard. What are your objectives here? Sarah smiled, and, for the first time since the conversation began, it seemed genuine rather than threatening. My objectives are simple, Marcus. First, to make sure you understand that your behavior was unacceptable and won't be tolerated. Second, to educate you about the realities of military service so you can make more informed judgments in the future. And, third, to establish clear boundaries for how you interact with me going forward. She stopped pacing and looked directly at each of them. The first objective has been accomplished. You clearly understand that targeting colleagues based on their military background has consequences. The second objective is in progress, you're learning things about military service that you didn't know before. Jake nodded eagerly. I definitely am. I had no idea that special operations involved so much strategic thinking and problem solving. Most people don't, Sarah agreed. Which brings us to the third objective. Going forward, here's how this is going to work. She moved to stand behind her chair, her hands resting on its back in a posture that conveyed both professionalism and authority. You're going to treat me the same way you treat any other consultant at this firm. You're going to judge my work based on its quality, not on assumptions about my background. You're going to keep your opinions about military personnel to yourselves unless you're invited to share them. Her voice grew harder. And if you have concerns about my performance or qualifications, you're going to address them through proper channels, with our supervisors or HR, rather than gossiping about them in public spaces. Brad made one final attempt to salvage his position. You can't control what we say in private conversations. Sarah's laugh was genuinely amused. Brad, there's nothing private about loudly discussing a colleague's qualifications in a crowded cafeteria. But, you're right that I can't control your private conversations. I can, however, control how I respond to discriminatory behavior in public spaces. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a level that forced them to strain to hear her. And, let me be very clear about something. If I hear any more comments about diversity hires, special treatment, or unfair advantages, if I learn that you're spreading rumors about my qualifications or my hiring process, or if you create any kind of hostile work environment based on my military background, I will file formal complaints with HR and pursue every available remedy under company policy and federal law. The threat was delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had carefully considered all available options and was prepared to follow through on every one of them. Marcus looked genuinely frightened. That seems like an overreaction. We were just having a conversation. Were you? Sarah asked. Because from my perspective, you were engaging in workplace harassment based on my veteran status. That's not just inappropriate, it's illegal under federal employment law. She straightened up, her posture conveying finality. But, here's the thing, Marcus. I don't want to file HR complaints or pursue legal remedies. I want to do my job, contribute to this company's success, and work with colleagues who respect my qualifications and treat me professionally. Her expression softened slightly. The choice is yours. You can learn from this conversation and adjust your behavior accordingly, or you can continue down the path that led to this confrontation. But, if you choose the second option, you should understand that there will be consequences. Jake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Sarah, I want to apologize. Not because I'm worried about consequences, but because I was wrong. I made assumptions about you and about military service in general that were unfair and inaccurate. He paused, clearly struggling with his emotions. I'm embarrassed by the way I acted, and I'm grateful that you took the time to educate me rather than just reporting the whole thing to HR immediately. Sarah studied his face carefully, then nodded slowly. Apology accepted, Jake. And I appreciate that you're willing to acknowledge your mistakes and learn from them. She turned to Marcus, who was staring at the table in front of him. Marcus? Do you have anything you'd like to say? Marcus looked up reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention from both Sarah and the employees at surrounding tables who were still watching the scene unfold. I'm sorry, he said quietly. You're right that we don't know anything about military service, and we shouldn't have made those comments. Sarah waited for him to continue, and, when he didn't, she prompted him. And? Marcus sighed heavily. And, I'll be more careful about how I talk about colleagues' backgrounds in the future. It wasn't the most enthusiastic apology she had ever received, but Sarah sensed that it was genuine within Marcus's limitations. Thank you, Marcus. I hope you'll also take some time to think about what you learned today. Finally, she turned to Brad, who had remained silent throughout the apologies. Brad? Brad looked up at her with a mixture of resentment and resignation. He clearly didn't want to apologize, but the situation had progressed beyond the point where he could maintain his defiant stance without serious professional consequences. I apologize for any offense caused by our comments, he said stiffly. It wasn't our intention to create a hostile work environment. Sarah recognized the carefully worded non-apology for what it was, an attempt to acknowledge the situation without accepting responsibility for his actions. Under other circumstances, she might have pressed for something more substantial. But she also recognized that Brad's attitudes weren't going to change based on a single conversation, regardless of how dramatic it had been. Thank you, Brad, she said simply. I hope you'll give some thought to what we discussed today. She picked up her tray from where she had set it down at the beginning of their confrontation, checking her watch as she did so. The entire exchange had taken less than 30 minutes, though it felt like hours. Gentlemen, she said, addressing all three of them one final time. I hope this has been educational for all of us. I certainly learned something about the importance of addressing misconceptions before they become entrenched. She turned to go, then paused and looked back at them. And, just so we're clear, my door is always open if any of you want to learn more about military service or if you have questions about how military experience applies to business consulting. But, the next conversation will be based on mutual respect and genuine curiosity, not on stereotypes and assumptions. With that, she walked away from their table, moving through the cafeteria with the same controlled confidence she had displayed throughout the confrontation. As she passed other tables, she could see employees looking up at her with expressions ranging from admiration to curiosity to slight apprehension. At the cafeteria exit, she paused and looked back one final time. The three marketing executives were still sitting at their table, clearly processing what had just happened. Jake appeared thoughtful, Marcus looked chastened, and Brad seemed angry but subdued. Sarah smiled to herself as she pushed through the glass doors and headed toward the elevators. It hadn't been the quiet breakfast she had planned, but it had been a necessary conversation. And, despite the confrontational nature of the exchange, she felt optimistic about the outcome. She had accomplished her objectives, the inappropriate behavior had been addressed, education had been provided, and clear boundaries had been established. More importantly, she had done it all without compromising her professionalism or giving anyone grounds to question her fitness for the corporate environment. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Sarah reflected on the morning's events. It wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice about her military background, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But it was a reminder that the transition from military to civilian life involved battles that couldn't be fought with weapons or traditional tactics.
These were battles for respect, understanding, and equal treatment that had to be won with patience, education, and the careful application of the strategic thinking skills that the three men had been so quick to dismiss. The elevator reached the 15th floor, and Sarah stepped out into the familiar environment of her consulting firm. She had work to do, clients to serve, and problems to solve. The morning's confrontation was over, but the real test would be in the days and weeks that followed, as she continued to prove through her performance that their assumptions about military personnel had been as wrong as she had told them they were.